Okay, I'll start out with, obviously for time's sake, I've already merged together this image. It's actually 15 shot space, 2/3 of a step in between. I'm starting in the reset mode just so I could show in the upper right-hand corner the actual display that this lighter gray box is basically showing you that even though this is a 32-bit file, this gray box is showing you what's being shown in the screen right now. So if I just click this and drag it, move it, you'll see that I can show just the bright parts of this entire 32-bit image. And the same is true if I bring it down to the other end. You can see that there's a lot of detail out the windows.
Yeah, I think the
And then
refresh
just
is taking a while. There we go. Yeah, so you're starting.
okay,
This is
I'm
a
probably moving it too fast.
Yeah, this is so it's important to note here that unlike a lot of other applications, HDR Expose 2 and 32 float are working on the full 32-bit image data that you have after you've merged the image. So the light gray area that Michael is showing is what can be currently displayed on the screen. So the challenge in tone mapping is to process the image so that everything important fits into that gray box. So that's what we're going to do now. Let's set that back to the default position. So this is what
Sure.
you're
I just
showing
double
there
clicked it. It should refresh.
is how you're able to preview the range of this image. And the dynamic range that we've measured here is 17.4, basically 17 and a half stops of useful dynamic range in this image that we're going to then tone map now.
I'm going to choose the first one. I generally tend to keep things a little flatter in the early phase rather than add contrast. So I'm going to use the first preset, which is linear. And from here, this is one of these things where I didn't take my own advice. I shot it in auto white balance. So one of the first things I'll have to tweak is to try and tame some of the colors here. So before I actually do the tone mapping itself, I'm kind of a stickler with working with color. So I mean, I could use the white balance dropper and try and find something that's a little bit neutral out here as a starting point. A lot of times, actually, it looks like that was probably dead on because it didn't move the white balance at all. But just use the eyedropper. And this is where I was saying before, if you have digital targets out in the room, you could choose an actual digital target if you first merged the frames with the digital targets in frame. So I'm just going to manually adjust some of these sliders so it's like visually a little bit closer. I don't want to spend all my time doing this, but just a little bit more. Okay, that's close enough. It's a starting point. And I'm going to come back and make some other color changes specifically in the channels. But for now, I'm going to come back to the tone mapping, and it's already in the auto, but I'm going to make some exposure changes in here that are a little bit more to taste like it seems like it's a little too bright for a starting point for me. I'd rather actually just bring up the shadows and bring the overall exposure down. The highlights at 136, the higher that number is, the more it tries to pull in windows. Sometimes if it gets too high, it starts to flatten out the contrast in the windows. So I'm going to just drag this down a little bit down to, I don't know, somewhere around here. So you have a little bit more of a natural look where it is brighter outside than it is inside. And then with shadows, I'll probably just pull the shadows up. Sometimes I get pretty aggressive with the shadows, and this is where it really matters whether you're shooting APS-C or full frame. So I'm going to be pretty aggressive on just clicking up here in the shadows. And you can always add contrast, and this is the key point. I always add contrast back really in Photoshop. You can do it in here, so if you wanted to do the contrast changes within here, you could just use the contrast tools that are here, make slight contrast adjustment. And then I'll come down, as I talked about before, like under color, in addition to the white balance tools, you also have what I've already twirled down, which is saturation channels. So if for whatever reason you feel as though it's a little too blue, now if you've ever been here, it's like the Caribbean. It's emerald green waters and tremendous blue, but if you feel as though the saturation's a little bit too hot here, you could just pull back a little bit of both the cyan and the blue, and then that way you're changing the saturation in those levels right there. I generally try and keep away from oversaturation issues. it looks like there's some red that's out here that's a little bit hot. So if you want, I'll do a dramatic change to show that it'll just attack those reds. And I'll bring it back to, I just wanted to make some slight adjustments to those reds right there. You have sharpening and noise reduction as well. So you have tools within here. I'm not going to actually touch on those. I usually do, well, the first thing I do for noise reduction is I take enough bracketed shots so that there's so much good, clean data in the shadows that you're not going to have as big of an issue from a starting point. And you could, within the tone tuning, you could change the black point. Now I know with this image I can see how dark it is in here right now, so I'm going to make an adjustment and it's going to affect that there. But on some images, changing the black point adds back a nice amount of contrast just to the blacks. In this particular instance, I think I'm going to just leave it at 0 because I'd rather within Photoshop hit a contrast on there. You also have the tone curve, which you can adjust to affect, obviously, very similar to the John, how do you describe this as being a contrast?
Yeah, that's the 32-bit contrast curve. It only works on the brightness channel of the image, so you're able to do contrast changes without creating color shifts.
That's exactly what I was getting at, because I knew that you talked about how it affects it doesn't affect the color, and that's one of the reasons why I love the applications that you have. The way it works in the color space where you're affecting luminosity and not color is tremendous. So, you know, this image I could probably tweak a little bit more in Photoshop, and but I'd say for now it's probably, it's fine, and I don't want to run out of time showing that the next process in 32 float's a little bit longer. So I don't want to lose out on that. So I'm going to jump over to Photoshop.
Sure.
I would save this out, but what I've already done is I've already pre-saved it out and threw it into Photoshop, so I'm just going to cancel out of this.
Now, we've had questions too regarding your final, the final output of your process or your products. Are most of these ending up on the web, or are they going to print, or how are you delivering your final product?
Most of my work is for the web. However, a lot of the rental management companies and the builders, they do print. So when I edit, I always edit at the highest level so that it's going to be a print, and then I export out web-sized as a final. So I always work and stay in ProPhoto RGB as long as I can. Obviously 32-bit until I export out, and then when I export out, I go Photo Pro RGB. And then I use those to actually pull into Lightroom and export out whatever JPEGs for clients.
Okay.
So all I did here is basically just add a couple of adjustments. So I brought that image that I was just working on and just made just really slight adjustments here. If I wanted to, I could tweak things a little bit further on the windows. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on that. I just wanted to show that, a little extra color balance, just levels or curves, just to get the color a little bit more even. Yeah, just little stuff there, and then, hit it with sharpening. I do things like I hit it with like a really high percentage on sharpening, so I'll hit it with like 300% at only like 0.3, and you get like this kind of wicked little pixel crispness without creating halos.
So how many images again did you use for that one? How many original files did you shoot?
It was 15 shots with a D3 spaced 2/3 of a step in between.
15
because
shots.
one EV is a huge jump. I took that same bracketed image that I did before, and while I'm talking about that, I'll launch the filter for 32 float. But I took that last one that I just did. It was 15 shots, 2/3 of a step in between. What I did was I figured out which of the brackets was in the middle, and then I did a pseudo 3 AEB with 2 EV steps, and it would not pull in all of the windows, and the shadows were much noisier. So it's like, there's so many tutorials out there. Oh, 3 AEB is fine, and it's just not. I mean, especially for shooting these huge dynamic range scenes, you're gonna frustrate yourself to no end, because the software is never gonna fix things that don't exist. As in, you didn't capture the full dynamic range on the sensor, so there's no way you're gonna be able to create a quality image in post. You're going to get all sorts of gradation issues. You're going to get all sorts of banding when you have huge steps in between each shot. You're never going to be able to fix that in post. So what I did was I launched 32 float here from, and again, I was in Photoshop. I had merged this scene. This scene also was 15 shots, spaced. I'll go to the reset so we can actually see what the range was. This one was 14.62 EB. So that's the original, just like in HDR Expose 2, this is what the original 32-bit file would look like. If I drag that gray box around to the left or the right, I can actually view out the windows or into the shadows themselves, and that's just for, viewing sake. So I'm going to start out with the tone mapping linear. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to double process this image. I'm first going to adjust the image so that the interior is the way I like it, and the reason is because I find that with pulling in windows and masking, you just get a more natural looking result if you don't try and pull it all in together in one shot. And that's the reason why I love 32 float within Photoshop. So what the first step on this one, I'm just going to pull up the exposure as the first step, and I just want to get the brightness in the room itself. And I'm not concerned about the windows. I know they're going to blow out. In fact, I'm even going to take the highlight slider down to lower because I'm really not concerned about trying to pull up every single ounce of that data out the window, because I'm going to end up masking that back anyway. Now, I didn't previously load this image and move it around. That's why I knew I was going to need more time to actually work on this image here.
Okay.
So normally I would go to color. A lot of times I'll go to the color settings first, but in this case I'm kind of going backwards, trying to find something that's relatively neutral, and then I'll make slight adjustments because I don't have digital targets out there, so I'm kind of leaning on anything that's kind of in the neutral state.
And now you're trying to balance
now I would get
the tungsten interior
yes.
with the daylight out exterior, right?
Yeah, I'm just trying to. I'm not even concerned about that right in there because I'm going to fix that on the next frame. All I'm really trying to do in here is just fix a lot of the issues that are inside. And one of the things that you'll find is you want to come down to the saturation channels, because you'll find tungsten a lot of times is either going to show up in the red or the yellow. So I'm going to aggressively bring down yellow at first just to see how that affects it, just to try and get rid of like the orange haze that hits a room. And it may seem like I'm desaturating quite a bit here, but remember, when you add back curves in Photoshop, like as a final step or adjustments, it really pops the color back in anyway. So a lot of times I'm trying to keep the saturation a little bit muted in this stage, and I might even pull the saturation itself down, the overall saturation for every single channel down just a little bit, because it's going to get added back when I start to do stuff, on the actual layers themselves. So I'm going to stop here and just say, okay, that's close enough. I don't want to like lose time and not have any time to answer any questions, so I'm going to save this one out, make one final adjustment. I just think I wanted to boost that up just a little bit more. Now down here, this is the key. Upon apply, I'm looking at the lower center screen. Upon apply, convert to, you need to keep this in 32-bit if you want to be able to relaunch the same 32-bit file and then retone map. So I'm going to click OK. It's going to bring us back. It's going to create a layer. It's going to add a mask automatically for us. So that was the layer that we just tone mapped. I'm going to turn it off just so visually. I'm going to reselect the background. I'm still in 32-bit space, so I'm going to come back up and relaunch 32 float on the same background layer. And I'll be able to make tweaks this time, and I'm going to target the windows as much as possible to try and get the color and the contrast out the windows to be much nicer, and not be as concerned about the fact that it will get darker on the interior when I'm doing this. And then I'll show you the masking that I do in post.
And
so I'm just going to start here. It's already on the.
How are you,
John?
when you look at this image now, and you're going to process this in 2 steps. When you look out the window, how are you adjusting the brightness of the exterior to make it make it look as natural as possible? Because sometimes I've tried the same thing, and you know, it looks great when I'm just looking at the highlights, but then when I merge the image together, it's, you know, too dark or too bright outside. Is that just the
Well, the key here
experience?
is some of it's what you're going to see here, and then the rest of it's going to be how I tweak that layer in Photoshop once it is a layer. So
Okay.
right now, I'm not as concerned about it getting dark in here, and this is where, because I'm really going to be painting in the better window data, I'm not as concerned about these. Now, I want the frames to be as light as possible, so the easiest way to do that is to actually bump up the shadows as much as possible. Now, I'm not going to be, you know, bringing back in this part of the room, so even though it's pulling the shadows up probably too much and it looks very odd, I just need to make sure I'm not pulling up shadows so tremendously out the window that it looks unnatural. I generally do not add contrast here. I'm going to add contrast just to show you the difference. If you add the contrast, what ends up happening is you darken the frames of the windows here. So if I do anything at all, I'm actually doing things opposite. I actually go to less contrast on this part, because I'm going to add the contrast back as a final step. And by lessening up the contrast, I'm actually helping the highlights get pulled back in a little bit here. I think I didn't mean to keep the local contrast connected. I was just trying to do a global change to the overall contrast. So yeah, I might tweak this a little bit further, but I don't want to run out of time, so I'm just going to stop here, and I'm going to go and layer these together and show you some things that I do in post.
Okay.
Now the color, I'm not even going to mess with the color because that's almost what the daylight temperature was outside. I'm pretty sure I was around that Kelvin. If I was off, like let's say it was like way too blue, because you would custom white balance for the interior, then I could have used the white balance tools to have gotten the color out the window to look good. So now what I have is the two layers. I have the layer where the interior is well lit. I may even overshot it just by a hair, but it's going to be too late to go back at the moment. But then I'm going to pull in this window data via masking. So the first thing I need to do in order to do the masking is I need to knock this entire file down to 16-bit. So image mode 16 bits per channel. As I was exporting that other one, I could have chosen the 16-bit and it would have knocked the whole image down itself, but I had saved it as the 32, so I had to do the image adjustment this way. I don't want to merge these together, obviously, because I've done no masking, so I'm just going to choose this don't merge. So it's going to knock it down to 16 bits. I'm going to end up with all three layers. So now this is where, you know, the magic per se begins, and I always start with the bottom layer is always the bright layer for me. I found this to be a better way to actually bring the windows together. And then what I do is I flip the mask by just doing Command or Control I, so it just blackens the mask, so now nothing is showing through. And now what I do is I go over to channels, and whatever the display is that you have currently in Photoshop is the luminosity that you're going to grab when you go into the channels palette. So if you've never gone to the channels palette before, I'm probably going to lose quite a few people here, but this is the process that I teach, and this is the process that I go through. You either Command or Control, depending if it's a Mac or PC, hold that down, and then you left-click on the RGB, and you're going to see the marching ants show up, and what you have effectively done is you just selected the luminosity of that image. And to show that, I'm going to come down in the Channels palette, and I'm actually going to click on the button that looks like the mask button, but it's actually Save Selection as a Channel, and then it just created an alpha channel based on this selection. Now I'm going to deselect by hitting Command or Control D so that the marching ants go away, and I'm going to come down to the alpha channel to show you that in fact is what was just selected when that one single Command or Control click on the RGB. That's what was actually selected. I only created the channel just to show this to you. You don't have to actually click Create the Channel. This is just to visually show what's going on. Now I'm going to reload the selection so I can show you by using extra clicks. I'm going to come back up to the RGB, and with these marching ants selected, I'm going to do Control or Command, Alt, Shift. So all three of those, Command or Control, Alt, Shift, and then the icon changes on the hand, and then you left-click one more time on the RGB, and what happened there is it actually cut the luminosity in half. Now I'm going to do it one more time. Command or Control, Alt, Shift, left-click the RGB, and it's cutting the luminosity down again. And to show that to you visually, I'm going to come back down into the Channels palette and choose that Save Selection as a channel. I'm going to hit Command or Control D to get rid of the marching ants, just so I could show this to you. So this was the single click, and then this was clicking it 2 more times targets just the highlights. You could actually have clicked on it again to go even deeper into the highlights. And the reason this is important is because if you choose that, if I had just left the selection as it was and then moved back to layers, I'd been fine. But because I was wanting to show this to you visually, I need to bring this back down and actually create that alpha channel as a selection. So now it's been reselected. Make sure you click the RGB before you go back. So now, because that selection's there, now by selecting the mask itself, which is currently black, making sure that you have white selected over in the tools palette, brush by either clicking the brush or hitting B, using the opener or closed brackets to change the size. And I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to be particularly concerned. But what you do is you just basically brush across the windows now, and it's only pulling a little bit into the frames. I really need to speed this up, so I'm going to be haphazard of sorts. But you'll see it. I'm going to get through the whole process. There's enough time to get through the whole process. I'm just not going to be really anal about it. And you'll see that it's laying down for the highlights, but it's not really adding a tremendous amount of data where the frames are black, because you use that luminosity so well. I'm going to hit Command or Control D to deselect. Now it looks really flat to you because all it did was that super highlights. And I'm going to go back to the channels to choose the original alpha that had a little bit more whites in it. And I'm going to bring back in here, and I'm going to stay more centered into the frame. Now, that's a good point. I just messed up. I'm going to hit Command Z. I had the actual image selected. You have to make sure that you have the mask selected when you do this.
Yeah, this is this is a lot of advanced Photoshop work. Having a lot of folks asking questions about the process, and if you have that noted on your blog or on your website or in your training videos that you do.
In the training videos, yes. I go over it very slowly. I'm actually going to use the original base layer to target the highlights again one last time to come in here. And it's like, that's why I said I know that I was going to lose some people when I did this, because it's some of this stuff is, if you've never seen it before, if you don't even know you can go into the channels and do this, then it's kind of hard to actually replicate this. But what I'm going to do is now that that's selected, I know they still don't look perfect, but one of the key factors, one of the key things that I do is, once I've done this, and I would have spent more time to have brought out more detail in here. My machine was just freaking out. I had to click on that just to get it to give this to me. So I'm just going to hit on a few of these areas without the mask. So this is one of the most important parts of the steps, is that I duplicate it, so you can hit Command or Control J and duplicate it, and then I actually bring the opacity down to roughly 13, 14, 15%, and I change the blend mode of that top one to overlay. So that way when I increase it, it starts to create a higher contrast, and I'll dramatically drag it back and forth, but it creates a higher contrast. The other thing I'll do is I'll go back to the original window layer itself, not the mask, the layer itself, and I hit this with Image, Adjustments, Shadow Highlights, so that the frames that got dark, you can pull up the shadows on the frames itself, so it just affects the shadows of that window layer that you had masked in. And you might want to add a little mid-tone contrast to see how that adjustment works as well.
Now, this two-step process that you're showing with Float, that's something you only use for really dramatic scenes, right? You're not doing this with every image, right? So for the bulk of your work, you're able to do that, just as pretty much most of the HDR processing just in one pass in 32 Float or HDR Expose, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is when you want it to look absolutely as much as possible, the contrast out the window as much as possible to be real, because with that overlay layer, you can even hit the overlay layer just for another boost is to actually hit the overlay layer as maybe as a final step to change the contrast out the window. Um, and you'll see that it'll sometimes brighten them up big time. You can use the highlights to actually bring down just the highlights out the window. Now, this is probably one of the worst window pulls I've ever done in my life, but I did it in like 7 minutes, and I was just trying to actually describe the process.
Sure.
But this is the process that I do. I actually, in 32 float, target the interior, target the exterior, and then I do this where I do the custom masking on the windows and adjust the contrast and the overlay layer of the windows only, and that's what creates a more realistic look out the window. The other reason that you do this is because then you could do things like there's certain things in the room itself that you can then use the overlay mode to kind of paint in a little extra hyper contrast to certain things. Sometimes you got to dial it back; it doesn't look quite right. But this is one of these things where I'm now on what was the window layer that was in overlay that I hit with a highlight shadows, and I can create back and add an extra contrast. And if I didn't like something, obviously, I could just either fade it or, Command or Control Z to get rid of it. But if I pull these two together, I mean, basically, it's like I'm going to group these. This was, where I didn't pull in the windows, and then turning it back on. That's adding back in the windows. Probably the worst pull I've ever done in my life. And I didn't even address what was up here with I didn't even touch this. When I was masking in, I didn't even bother to grab that. But I had the data up in that bulbs that I could have done that. And if for whatever reason I couldn't get the color right, that's where it gets into a Photoshop tutorial where you just create a new layer and
Sure.
flip it to color. And then you can brush in this case, like, you could brush out problematic colors.
Right. So I have another business question from one of the attendees. How much of your time do you spend on location versus working on the photos in post? And do you charge extra for, for the additional post production time, or is that all part of your standard rate?
No, for me, I have I have a 90-10 split. I do 90% of my work is just one way. It's one price. That's the way it is, and it's a per property fee plus a per shot fee. And then I have another one where dealing with realtors where they don't need as high end of work, but it's still really, really nice. And that I don't do quite as much post processing, and I have a separate pricing. But it's only about 10% of my business because most folks come to me for the full edits.
And you said you typically do for a rental property, you do 16 different shots, right? That's for the
that's local to me because there's a vacation rental by owner, vrbo.com, homeaway.com. So in the vacation markets, a lot of the rental companies really value photography because it increases bookings and the rental company makes money. I mean, I've had rental companies tell me, Mike, I make money off you. Like, you're not a cost, you're an investment, even though I'm not cheap. So it's the whole idea that the people that get it really get it, and the realtors that are dealing with really high-end listings, they get it. But that's the reason why I have kind of a lower end, not as much editing to a services. Because if somebody has a $200,000 condo or $150,000 home, they just don't have the money to spend on a full-blown edit. So for time at a property, I can get in and out of a 3-bedroom, 3-bath condo or home, shoot the entire thing with a tripod and a camera in under an hour. I mean, I've gotten wicked fast. I've shot over 1,000 properties in like the last 5 years. So I'm really, really fast, but I like to take my time.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have to be fast, I can be because I don't have all the gear to lug around. And that's where HDR is really critical.
Great. We're getting close to the end of the webinar. I'm just going to go through some of the questions here. And I think we want to point out before we end a couple of things. Michael, you have why don't you put up your URL or your contact information where folks can contact you directly if they are interested in attending one of your workshops or at maybe even hiring you to photograph their property or look for your video tutorials. I also want to mention that the software that the software that I used, our HDR Expose 2 and 32 float version 2 are all available as free 30-day trial downloads from our website. So feel free to go to unifiedcolor.com and download those free 30-day trials. They're fully functional for 30 days, no watermarks, so you can use them for real work. And then they just time out after 32 days, and then you'll have after 30 days, and then you'll have a chance to purchase it, the license key for it. We also have other video tutorials on our website as well under under the support section. So, Michael, this is your blog.
Yeah, hdriblog.com, and there's a little email box here that just basically just anything that I ever post, you get an email what that post was. It's like an RSS feed. It's feed burner. So, when I announce the new videos that I've been working on, my new workflow, you get an email for that, and then of course I share a lot of free information. So if you put in your email address there, it's through FeedBurner. It's just the RSS feed. So anytime I make an update on the blog, you'll be notified via email that evening.
And we try to put a lot of information into 1 hour of time. And I know that's not nearly enough, but you do have video tutorials or your own video education services that you provide, as well as workshops, right? So they'll get that information if they want to follow up with you directly there, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. Okay, folks, well, it's been great. Our time is unfortunately up. Thank you so much for your time and for attending, and hope this has been informative, and look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Thanks again, Michael.
Thanks for the invite, John.
Thanks for watching. Please check out our other tutorials for more information on using the software and optimal workflow techniques.